Greetings all you movie junkies and entertainment lovers, and welcome to another top 10 video. Today we're going to be counting down my top 10 most underrated comic book movies. Of course, we all have our favorites, and some of them we agree on, some of them we disagree on. But a lot of them over the years, some more recent, some not so recent, have gone either unnoticed or underappreciated or have been misunderstood. And we all have our different opinions on which ones those are. So I thought today we would take a look back and go through what to me are the top 10 most underrated comic book movies. And as I always point out, it's important to remember this is just my personal list of top 10 most underrated comic book movies. So at number 10, we have 1997's Spawn. Unfortunately, the only live action version of Spawn still to this day, which is a shame because Spawn honestly is probably one of my favorite comic book characters ever. This movie, I will say, probably might be the contender for the second worst CGI of all time. Number one to me personally is still Lawnmower Man, but at least for comic book movies, I guess you could say this probably does have some of the worst CGI ever. I always say that you should judge CGI and special effects by the time period of which the film was released in, but even compared to the late 1990s, this CGI is terrible. That being said, as bad as the CGI is, as cheesy as other aspects of the film are, I honestly do think that there are a couple of things that it does have going for it. John Leguizamo as the clown, I thought was absolutely brilliant, both in his performance and his look. Michael J. White as Spawn was a great pick, and I personally really like the look of him as well. And overall, the practical effects in this movie, honestly, I think are pretty fantastic. And I think had they gone more towards the practical effects side of things, and that perhaps they had gone a little bit more darker, a little bit more faithful, perhaps it might have been better received at the time, or at least now it would have been more of a cult classic. Maybe it's just because it's the only live action adaptation of Spawn that we have up to this point. Maybe had we gotten more, I would be more critical of it, but I still believe that it is definitely an underrated film, but certainly not a great film, which is why it's at number 10. And then at number 9, we have Wonder Woman 1984. Of course, it didn't make any money. It was during that whole day and date thing they did with HBO Max. The more you think about the plot in this movie, the less and less things make sense. In fact, there are a lot of things that just flat out don't make logical sense in this movie. And I think that that is really the main problem with this film. But that being said, I personally do feel that there are a lot of other aspects about this film unfortunately get ignored because of the aspects that don't work as well. And I actually do think that there are honestly a lot of other elements of this film that make it fun and enjoyable to watch. The whole sort of 1980s aesthetic of it, I actually thought was really great. And the look of this movie, in my opinion, I think it's just brilliant, and it really does have that sort of that classic old school comic book feel. The opening scene in the mall totally felt like a callback, and honestly it felt like I was watching an episode of the classic Wonder Woman series with Linda Carter. And I thought the road sequence was absolutely fantastic and might actually be slightly better than the No Man's Land sequence in the first film, in my opinion. And on top of that, all of the stuff with Chris Pine as the Steve Trevor being in this futuristic world that he doesn't know about, and it was totally a cool kind of reversal of what we saw in the first film. For me personally, I think it has a lot of fun aspects to it. Is it a great movie? No, but honestly I do think that it is a shame because there are a lot of fun aspects to this movie. If you go into this movie not thinking too much, I think that there's a lot of fun to be had. So that's Wonder Woman 1984 at number 9. And then at number 8, we have Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles Out of the Shadows, the sequel to the 2014 Ninja Turtles movie, which is a film that I am not particularly a big fan of. I think that it just did not get a lot of aspects of the Turtles right, but it did do very well at the box office, so of course 2 years later, they came out with Out of the Shadows. They actually honestly really tried to, at least in my opinion, take things in the right direction. Shredder wasn't a Transformer this time, he was a normal person person. Finally got to see Bebop and Rocksteady in live action. You've got Krang in there, got the Turtle Van in there. Overall, is it a great movie? No, but I do think that it honestly, they were really trying hard to take things in a right direction. It's a film that I've talked more about before and probably will talk about more in the future. But overall, I do think that is a shame how this movie did not do better at the box office, because I honestly think that they were trying to take this version of the Ninja Turtles in the right direction. There's problems, of course, that were established in the first film still exist, like April naming the turtles, which I absolutely hate. Well, I think that it is definitely an underrated film that a lot of people overlook. So that's Ninja Turtles Out of the Shadows at number 8. And then at number 7, we have Batman Forever. This film, has had a bit of an interesting history, because when it first came out, it actually was really successful. In fact, I believe it actually made even more money than Batman Returns. But somewhere along the line, something happened, and I think it was honestly all to blame on Batman and Robin, because of course, Batman and Robin, a lot of people consider it to be one of the worst comic book movies of all time. I don't think it's that bad. I think that honestly, it is one of those so bad it's good movies where you can honestly enjoy it for the ridiculous ride that it is. Honestly, I do think that the release of that movie, after that, something changed with this film where suddenly people started to lump this film in with Batman and Robin, and they just kind of lumped it in as, the Joel Schumacher Batman movies, and just started saying that, oh, the Joel Schumacher Batman movies are terrible, when really they should have just been saying that about Batman and Robin. For one thing, Jim Carrey's performance as the Riddler, although super goofy and over the top, works incredibly well. Obviously, some aspects like Tommy Lee Jones' version of Two-Face were a little bit problematic and not as accurate to the character in the comic books. There are other aspects of it that do, I think, work well. And is it the greatest comic book movie of all time? No. If you want to hear me talk more about it, be sure to check out my review I did a while back. I go much more in depth talking about why I feel this film is underrated. So that's Batman Forever at number 7. And then at number 6, we have Superman Free. This is a film that I know I'm very much in the minority on, in that I actually think that this is the best of the Christopher Reeve Superman movies. And I know I'm very much in the minority on that, but again, I have never understood exactly what it is that people have wanted out of this film, because to me it's no more or less goofier than the previous 2 movies, except one big difference I have always felt in this case is that this film to me has always felt a lot more self-aware of the kind of film that it is. And to say that it is a complete goof fest and doesn't have any serious moments at all, honestly, to me tells me that you haven't seen the movie in a while. I think, Christopher Reeve's performance in this, in my opinion, might be his best overall performance of the all 4 of Superman films that he did. Again, if you want to see me go more in depth on it, I did do a review of it a while back, so if you want to know more about why I feel that this film is underrated, be sure to check that review out. So that's Superman Free at number 6. And then at number 5, sticking with Superman, we have Superman Returns. This to me, I think, is a prime example, especially for me personally, of going into a film with certain expectations, but then being disappointed because the film itself didn't meet your personal expectations, as compared to just looking at and judging the movie for what it actually is. It's totally what happened with me with this, where the first time I watched it, I really wanted something that was more along the lines of what we ended up getting in Man of Steel, instead of this more sort of somber, kind of thinking romantic type movie that we ended up getting, that much more plays on the ideas of, the Superman complex. As somebody who, grew up really loving the Christopher Reeve Superman films, definitely a lot of elements in this and callbacks to that I think make it now a lot more enjoyable than it was the first time I saw it. Because the first time I saw it, I just remember thinking that, oh, Brandon Routh's performance is just a carbon copy of Christopher Reeve, and it wasn't, at the time when I saw it, it wasn't different enough, whereas now I watch it and the fact that it does share so many similarities and it is very much a spiritual sequel to those films is honestly what makes me really enjoy it and really love it. So I definitely, have had a change of perspective, and it really goes to show that with every movie, you should watch the movie and judge it by what it's trying to be, not by what you personally want it to be. And that is definitely totally what happened with me in this movie. Is it the greatest comic book movie ever made? I don't think so, but I honestly do think that there are a lot of interesting elements to it that often get overlooked. So that's Superman Returns at number 5. And then at number 4, we have Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness. Reaction to this movie was definitely a bit divided. A lot of people seem to, really love it and enjoy it like myself, and a lot of other people seem to really not like it and found it to be very disappointing. Honestly, it ties into a lot with what I just talked about with Superman Returns, in that I think a big thing that happened with this movie is that this film did not meet the expectations of a lot of people simply because it wasn't the film that they thought or wanted it to be. And the first thing I will say right off the bat is that I honestly do think that the title of this movie is very, very poor. Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness, I will say, is not a good fit for what this film actually is. Honestly, what this film should have just been called is Doctor Strange and the Scarlet Witch. Honestly, is a much better sounding title in my opinion, and it much more describes what the film is about, because it's about Doctor Strange and Wanda the Scarlet Witch. That is essentially what it's about. It is not really that much of a multiverse story. The multiverse is obviously a big part of the story, but it is not the central focus of what the story is about. And so Multiverse of Madness just doesn't really fit with what the film is. So I totally get why people went in with certain expectations and then were disappointed when it didn't turn out to be what they thought it was going to be. But honestly, if you really look and watch the movie for what it is, this movie, honestly, the best way that I can describe it is that it is a Marvel horror movie. Very much, takes the same template of a Marvel film, but it adds all these great horror aspects into it, which of course Sam Raimi is able to execute incredibly well. And I think that if you really look at it from that perspective, it works really, really well. And I have found that a lot of other people who enjoy this movie in the same way that I did are people who are big horror fans and fans of Sam Raimi's earlier horror works, because that really is what it's supposed to be. It is very much the bridge between the horror world and the superhero world. Elizabeth Olsen's performance as Scarlet Witch Wanda in this I thought was absolutely incredible, and just certainly does not get enough love and respect that it deserves. I think it's an awesome movie, and I do think that this is definitely a film of all the recent Marvel films. If I can see any of them being a turnaround on in later years, it's definitely this one. So that's Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness at number 4. And then at number 3, we have Sin City 2, A Dame to Kill For. Very long awaited sequel to Sin City, which literally took, 9 years, I believe, between the two films. The original Sin City, I think, is the greatest comic book film of all time, simply because it feels most like a comic book than any other comic book film. And the sequel, I remember when this was coming out, it just felt like the ads for this were everywhere. I mean, it was on buses, there were trailers, there were TV spots. They marketed the hell out of this thing. And then it just kind of came and went, and people just kind of forgot about it. This film is overall, I think, not quite as well structured, or not quite on the same level as the first film. I will say that I personally do think that just from a purely visual standpoint, I would argue that the visuals in Sin City 2 honestly are better than the first film. There are a lot of other aspects like the story elements and stuff that aren't quite as well crafted as that first movie. Sure, I'm honestly not entirely sure what it is that people wanted out of it, because it did do a pretty awesome job of capturing that same tone, that same comic book feel. It's a shame that we probably at this point will never get a third film because this film did so poorly. Anyway, so that's Sin City 2, A Dame to Kill For at number 3. And then at number 2, more Superman, we have Man of Steel. It might be even the most divided comic book film of all time, because, I mean, even to this day, over 10 years since its release, I still see people saying that this is the worst comic book movie ever made, and then other people saying that it's the best comic book movie ever made. And I do think that misunderstood is definitely a good word for this film, as I think that there are a lot of aspects to this film that just either went over people's heads or just again, it was a lot like Superman Returns, where it wasn't exactly what people wanted it to be. You know, all movies at the end of the day are, you know, subjective. We all look for different things in these films. But to me personally, I thought, you know, what they did with Man of Steel, I thought was brilliant. And Henry Cavill is personally my favorite Superman. Visually, this film was stunning. The soundtrack that Hans Zimmer did was stunning. I honestly have, you know, really come to appreciate and love this movie. And it's definitely one that I plan on talking more about probably in the future, because again, there are quite a lot of aspects of it that I do think are misunderstood or interpreted in the wrong way. So that's Man of Steel at number 2. Number 1, this was super difficult to decide. We have Batman Returns. I am a huge fan of both of the Tim Burton Batman movies. I think the whole aesthetic look and feel of Tim Burton and his mind and his sort of artistic style, I think fit really well with Batman. It just felt like Batman was at home in Tim Burton's hands. It felt like, you know, his style, just the way that he chose interpret the character and the world of Gotham City in a way that just made it fit so well. And I think that just from a purely tonal and look standpoint, I think the Tim Burton films are absolutely just masterful, and they're just gorgeous to watch. One aspect that I think really makes or breaks this movie with a lot of people is, I would say, Danny DeVito's version of the Penguin, because it really isn't comic book accurate at all, and they very much took the Penguin and made it their own. And honestly, in my personal opinion, they kind of improved the character of the Penguin, because really, when you go back, especially look at the older comic books, the Penguin, I'm sorry, just is not that particularly interesting of a character. It made the Penguin, you know, an interesting, disturbing, and weird character that Danny DeVito honestly played to perfection. I honestly think his performance in this is the best of his entire career. I thought he was absolutely brilliant in this film. So on top of that, we have easily the best Catwoman we have ever had to date in Michelle Pfeiffer's performance, when she is trashing the apartment and truly makes the transition from Selena Kyle to Catwoman. Still gets me, even now, in my opinion, the number 1 most underrated comic book movie of all time. Alright guys, that was my list of top 10 most underrated comic book movies. Feel free to jump in the comments down below and let me know what your top 10 most underrated comic book movies will be, whether they be similar or different than mine. So until next time, be sure to consume as much entertainment as humanly possible, and I will see you in the next video.